an environmental crisis of some kind, which is either a crisis of resource availability or it'll be a crisis of the environment as a dump for waste resources. And what we're seeing is that right now there's a lot of concern that the environment is one of the barriers that we need really to do something about, which is why there was this concentration on water and oil and all the rest of it, and the absorptive capacity of the environment to take all those wastes which we're generating. Then there's a question of new technologies. Where do the technologies come from? Well, actually, again, what happens here is that technology is so crucial and so important that everybody thinks that there's a technological solution to everything. So actually, technology becomes almost a fetish. So, as Marx kind of pointed out, again, way back in the last century, the invention of new technologies in itself becomes a business. And you invent the new technologies and then you make absolutely sure that they get deployed. All sorts of areas of this kind, like medical technologies, for example, where medical technologies are deployed where they need not be deployed. They're extremely expensive, but you force them through on all the hospital systems and all the rest of it. So the kind of technological side is important. But then there's always the question down the line of what about the market? Where's the extra money going to come from at the end of the day that you're selling it to? Well, there are three places it can come from. One is old wealth. So all of those people who have gold in their cellars and gold under their bed, you can get that out somehow and that becomes the money. Or you can use, as Rosa Luxemburg pointed out, imperialism to do it. For instance, when the British forced open China to the opium trade, they sold Indian-grown opium to China in order to get the Chinese silver to go to India that could then go to Britain to pay for the goods that the British were selling to India. Nice system, right? But of course it meant the violence of opening up China to the opium trade. But what happens when all of that gives out, that all of the past wealth has now been absorbed in and you're now in a global situation where there are no kind of open areas like China which are left? Well, the answer actually is a very interesting one, very important one, which you have to understand. That is, the demand which capitalists are going to make tomorrow in their expansion is going to be the demand which will mop up the need they had the day before to sell their product. Now that means there's a time gap between yesterday and tomorrow. How do you bridge that time gap? Credit. The credit system moves central. It bridges the gap. It says tomorrow's demand is going to be, for new raw materials, is going to be today's demand, which we're going to cover in the market so you can sell it to them on credit. Which puts tremendous importance on the financial system. Now, what happens if one of those barriers locks down so that you can't move any further? You get a crisis. A crisis of devaluation. Capitalists lose all their money. The system just starts to collapse. And therefore, one of the biggest problems for capitalism historically has always been how to mobilize all those elements I talked about of technology in relation to nature and all the rest of it in such a way as to overcome the crisis tendencies. Go past the crisis, get past it. And in so doing, a specific relation starts to emerge with urbanization. In other words, crisis resolution, the opening up of new opportunities, and the dynamics of capitalism connect to the urban process in crucial ways. Now let me give you just a couple of examples. First example would be Paris of the Second Empire. In 1848, there's a huge crisis of capital accumulation. Surplus capital and surplus labour side by side, and nobody knows how to put them back together. Massive unemployment, unrest, the workers rise up, create a revolution, the bourgeoisie gets terrified, mobilises military power to crush the revolutionaries, but then is faced with the question of how is it going to put all of this capital back to work? And the bourgeoisie can't figure out how to do it. And it was into that situation that there rode the figure of Louis Bonaparte, nephew of the great Bonaparte, and said, hey, I'll help you out. And so he gets elected president, stages a coup d'etat, then declares himself emperor. He says, we're going to have the Second Empire. Now he had to do two things. One was he had to squash dissent. So he created a police state. This was a pioneer of fascism. A police state, an authoritarian state. The police spies were everywhere. All of the working leaders were exiled or put in jail. Even the bourgeois leaders were put in jail. So he was no longer faced with any kind of opposition. So what did he do next? Well, he then had to put everybody back to work. And so in his great speech where he declared empire, he said, well, I'm going to do it by a massive program of public works. We're going to drain swamps, we're going to build new canals, we're going to build railroads and ports and harbour facilities. We're not only going to do it in France, we're going to do it abroad. So they did things like the Suez Canal and things like that. But above all, he said, we're going to do it in Paris. So he brought Haussmann to Paris to transform the city. Now, what did Haussmann do? Haussmann said, well, okay, I'm going to transform this city, and we're going to spend a lot of money doing it, and we're going to put capital and labour back to work in doing it. And in transforming the city, he successfully did that. Now, in order to do that, however, he needed some new instruments. And the new instruments he needed were new credit institutions. So he set up a whole series of credit institutions, and he was helped also by the Napoleonic regime that also gave a new role to the Bank of France. And they deficit financed all of the transformation of the city. Now, this transformation of the city in terms of building the boulevards had a couple of elements to it which are crucial to understand. The first is this. There have been lots of ideas and indeed several attempts to transform Paris in the 1830s and the 1840s. And in fact, some of the best ideas you could find were constructed by the anarchists, Fourierists, and the Saint-Simonians. Actually, Haussmann stole all their ideas. Often happens to us people on the left. We get good ideas and then they get stolen by somebody else who never acknowledges if they came from Marx or anywhere else, you know. So he stole all their ideas, but he did something very important in addition to stealing their ideas. He changed the scale at which he understood the urban. And the best way to think of this is there was an architect called Hittorf who'd been making new boulevards in the plans in the 1830s and 1840s, and he marched into Haussmann's office just after Haussmann took over and said, here's my plan for the new boulevard, and Haussmann took one look at it and said, not wide enough, you have it 40 metres wide, it should be 120 metres wide. Haussmann completely changed the scale at which he thought the city. He thought of it, he annexed the suburbs, he thought about the relationship between the periphery and the centre. He thought about, of course, the water supply. Yes, okay, I mentioned water, that's good. And the sewage disposal system, yeah, I mentioned that, that's good. So he transformed Paris, he set up, built the parks, he really changed the whole scale at which the city was thought. And in so doing, he successfully managed to absorb the capital and labour. But the other thing that was important, this goes back to Robert Park, that this wasn't simply a transformation of the physical nature of the city. This was a transformation of social relations. It was a transformation of consumption patterns,